Hello everyone, and welcome to our Make the Web Fast series here on Google Developers Live. Today we'll be talking about a very awesome tool called PageSpeed, which is a performance JIT for your website. So first off, my name is Ilya Grigorik. I work with the Make the Web Fast team, and with me today.
Hi, I'm Josh Marantz, and I work on the PageSpeed team.
Awesome. So Josh, I heard through the rumor mill that there is an upcoming 1.0 release for PageSpeed.
That's correct. The rumors are correct. We are releasing PageSpeed 1.0 next week after 2 years of beta. It's ready for broader adoption.
Wow. So true to Google philosophy of keeping everything in beta, that's 2 years and quite a few users, I think, as well, right? So it'll be really interesting to dive in and understand what's happening underneath, right? Because I've spent some time looking at what you guys have built, certainly worked with the team, and the first thing that stands out to me, I guess we have some slides that I've prepared, is that if you care about performance, there's a lot of stuff that you need to care about, right? In fact, my office mate, Steve Souders, wrote a couple of books on the subject, right? And there's stuff like image compression, combining your resources, and deferring JavaScript, cache extensions. Frankly, it's a full-time job to keep up with all the things that you need to do to keep your website fast.
Yeah, we believe that if you're building a website, you're trying to convey information, you're trying to sell a product, gain acceptance of an idea, communicate something.
Right.
You're not trying to hack your website to make it faster. So the less you have to focus on that, the better. Now, it is important that you make websites fast because you get more engagement, happier users, people will come back. But you don't want to spend all your time doing that.
Right, and that's actually a very good point, very important point, which is, of course, we care about speed, right? But speed in itself can be almost a full-time job because even these best practices change over time. The browsers get smarter, we get more video on the web, more images on the web. So these things shift, and you need to keep up with it, right? And not only that, but some techniques like, let's say, spriting images together or inlining resources in the page are actually pretty heavy in terms of required work, either for the design team or for the dev team, right? So it adds additional complexity to your development cycle, right? So it's not all just easy wins along the way.
And the other aspect is that sometimes it's hard to draw a balance between being able to keep your site up to date and keeping it cached. For example, everybody knows who works on web performance that the more assets on a website that are cached, the better. So if you go back to a typical newspaper site every day to see what the news is, you'll typically wind up downloading their JavaScript and their CSS, which hasn't changed, usually has not changed, every day because they have to set a fairly short cache lifetime. I typically see a minute or an hour at the most. In order so that they can push changes out when they want to, but they don't do it every day. They probably do it once every few weeks. And you want to be able to change your website on the fly and have that propagate quickly to everybody, but also have it so that when you don't change it, it stays in people's caches. So this is a complicated and messy thing to do manually. It's a very easy thing to do automatically.
Right, and I think that is the core insight behind PageSpeed, right? Which is to say, sure, you can apply all these optimizations yourself, and in fact, you should know them because they should be best practices on your team. But we can, in fact, automate some of the stuff, right? And that's what PageSpeed is all about. That's why we say it's a performance JIT, just-in-time compiler, in your web server. So maybe you can tell us a little bit as to what that actually means and how you guys have gone about doing this work.
Sure. There are a number of approaches to automated website automation, and our approach was to make it really easy to adopt. So half the websites around the world are powered by Apache web servers.
Right. Yep.
And so what we did was we packaged our optimization framework as an open source Apache module. So you pretty much in 3 commands can download our package, install it, and restart Apache, and your website runs faster.
That's a pretty compelling pitch.
There's then more you can do. There's a core set of filters that we believe is very safe, will benefit websites a lot, and be very safe to run on all websites. And those come on when you do that process.
Right.
But then there's more that you can do if you're willing to investigate and tune it a little bit.
Right.
But the whole idea was out of the box, really good performance.
Right, and safe, right? So
Yes.
your website shouldn't be broken. And I think we'll actually take a look at kind of deep in the guts of some of the filters and how they work. But before we even get there, one of the things that I wanted to highlight was that I believe my PageSpeed is actually based on another open source project.
That's right. So the way that it is structured is that we thought Apache was a very good delivery vehicle for our technology.
Right.
But we know it's not the only delivery vehicle for our technology that can ever exist. So we layered this as an optimization framework called the PageSpeed optimization libraries, which is not tied to any particular server. It's a plugin architecture, and we'll get into that more a little bit later. And then we packaged that with a connection to Apache, an Apache gasket, if you will, so that it's just plug and play, and you don't have to worry about how to structure it.
Is basically a wrapper around PageSpeed optimization libraries for Apache. But if I want to adopt it to some other server, maybe I've written one myself, or I'm using some other popular server, I could actually still reuse that same code.
Yes, and in fact, this is what we have done with PageSpeed service, so that we've now deployed this on two very different server stacks. One based on Apache, one an internal Google one, but we can bring the same technology to in two very different deployments, and we are looking to expand to any server that rises in popularity as well.
And PageSpeed service is our hosted version of this, which is actually still in beta, and we're still kind of field testing it with our customers, right? But it's actually running on the same code base, if you will.
Yes.
Very cool. So I think we covered some of this, right? We have a 1.0 coming. We know that it's an Apache module. You guys have been working on it for over 2 years. And you actually mentioned some of the core filters and optional filters. And it sounds like there's quite a few.
Yeah, there's a wide variety of, there's a lot of ideas. Web performance is a topic that invites papers, it invites conferences. Many companies are founded around this, and there's lots of ideas that are pouring into this. But we try to take the ones that are most effective, that are incredibly robust and predictable, and put them into the core set so that the out-of-the-box experience is really good. And then there are a lot of other things that we are working on, that we're validating, that we're making sure are really solid and we'll make it in. And there's others that we think will probably always be kind of a manual configuration kind of option. A good one of these is where we defer JavaScript. That's a complicated thing to do, and it has generally amazing effects on websites, but it is something that you want to hand validate, and you don't want to just turn that on.
So I think this highlights kind of a general point, which is to say there is a core set of filters that you should be able to turn on, or that will be turned on once you install them at PageSpeed, and your site should just go faster. But depending on your site, you probably want to spend some time going through the available filters and just seeing which ones may apply to your site, right? And you'll be able to get more performance benefits out of Mod PageSpeed. Very cool. So I think we're going to dive into the details of some of these, but I do want to touch on one point, which is we do support 2.2 and 2.4 of Apache.
That's correct. Apache 2.4 support came out recently, and that's in our 1.0 release as well.
Awesome. And you mentioned that it's just a couple of lines, so we have, I guess, Debian and or packages for Debian and RPMs that you can just install.
We do, although external developers have generated packages for OpenSUSE and even for Windows. That so we support. It's an open source product, and we have a build process and instructions for doing that, and so people can put up other packages. FreeBSD is another one that has support.
Right. So I can just build it from source.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Cool. And then one more thing for 1.0. I know that until recently, or until we ship 1.0, there was one release tree, if you will, or one package, right? And I think moving forward, once we release 1.0, we'll actually have two.
That's right. The current release package, so if you're using Mod PageSpeed today, you're on the beta channel if you installed from binaries. And we're going to continue to have that beta channel, but the 1.0 release introduces a new stable channel. And the way that this will work is that we will release new features into beta, and after we're really comfortable and solid with them, then we'll update the stable channel. And then when you update your packages on your operating system with yum update or updating the Debian package system, you'll upgrade based on the channel that you've selected.
Cool. That makes sense. All right. So let's dive into the guts of it, right? But I think we touched on this already. I'll just mention it briefly. The whole point, I guess, of mod PageSpeed is to highlight the things that you don't need to do, right? So instead of having to worrying about, do I need to have an extra build process for optimizing images or concatenating my CSS or JavaScript or all the rest, all of that is taken care of by mod PageSpeed. And in fact, that means that I don't need to modify my current workflow or my team's workflow to take advantage of all these optimizations.
That's exactly the point. It's a drop-in solution for performing best practices for web
So the
performance.
clients, or the visitors, I should say, would see the optimized resources. I still have my original resources in my dev environment, and mod PageSpeed does the rest.
Exactly.
Very cool. So you mentioned this earlier, right? We have over 100,000 mod PageSpeed installs today since you guys announced the product. And in fact, there's a number of partners who have already installed it as part of their hosting infrastructure, right? So for example, I know that in DreamHost or GoDaddy, you can actually go into your control panel, click, I think it's in these settings, I'm not sure exactly where in the menu it is, but I know that there's a checkbox that you say, please accelerate my site, and all of a sudden the site goes faster. And what happens under the hood is they enable mod PageSpeed for your site.
That's exactly right. Having that checkbox to just turn it on is even easier than the 3-step install process that I mentioned earlier.
So it's like the turbo button back in the old days, right? It's like, make my site fast. Why wouldn't you turn that on? Very cool. So let's dive into, I guess, some of the guts. Or, here's an example, right?
Yeah, so the best way to see it in action, this is a shopping website, and we made a video comparing that site, a first view of that site on Chrome, with mod PageSpeed off and with mod PageSpeed on. And this is...
So this is a recording, side-by-side recording of on and off. Wow.
Correct. So so this video is made with web page test, which offers all kinds of opportunities.
So I'm just going to play that again just so you guys can see it. Right, so the page loads in 2.1 seconds, and then the other one takes about 5 seconds, right, if I scroll back here. And you can see that the mod PageSpeed one loads a lot faster. And there could be many reasons for this, right? I'm guessing it's a combination of filters that come into effect to make this difference. But it's 200% faster or more here.
Yeah, it's also important to note that even though the rendering takes 2.1 seconds, it's actually pretty visible after probably less than a second.
Right, so if I just scrub back here, so 1.8 seconds in, we already have the page, whereas the other one is blank.
Right.
Right, so that's a dramatic difference.
So we can see a little bit of why that happened by going to the next slide.
Okay.
So so those that have dabbled in web performance have seen these waterfall diagrams. They're available in Firebug.
That's the bread and butter.
They're available in Firebug and the Chrome developer tools, and these are from web page test. And again, this is from Chrome.
So this is the same website, right?
Yeah.
We're just looking at the waterfall charts.
Exactly, the same exact website. On the left, the waterfall chart is tall, which means there's a lot of resources, and it's wide. There's a lot of wide blue bars. Those wide blue bars are big images, which don't need to be nearly that big. And so on the right, they become a lot skinnier. There's also a lot less bars. So the two things that are most visible in the waterfall diagram in terms of the effects of mod PageSpeed filters are, one, optimizing images. So there's actually 3 ways in which the images are optimized. Number one, mod PageSpeed looks at the context in which images are displayed. Very often images are taken from cameras at full resolution and instantiated into very small divs or elements in HTML, 100 by 200 or something, and there's way more pixels being sent down to the browser than the browser needs. And this wastes bandwidth and it wastes CPU time on the browser resizing. So it's much better to resize in the server, but who wants to do that? Well, turn on mod PageSpeed and it happens automatically. The other thing is that the images are typically at a much higher quality ratio than you need for an LCD display or a Retina display, and it is pretty straightforward to remove a lot of the bytes of that image without reducing any visible quality. And the third point is that modern web browsers, including Chrome and Opera, support a more modern format of image called WebP, which Google released over a year ago,
Yep.
Which for the same quality can get you about 30% less bytes.
Right.
And so this is not something you would do manually, but an automated tool can tune the experience, tune the HTML that's delivered and the images that are delivered to the browser in question. So
Right.
PageSpeed can take a JPEG resource and transcode it and deliver it as WebP to Chrome and Opera, and to other browsers deliver it as JPEG so that it works either way.
Right.
So between all of those, we shrunk this site way down. And actually, the waterfall diagram, if that blue line represents the onload event.
Right. Yep.
What happens after the onload event in this particular site is third-party widgets that are loading asynchronously, which is great. So the site was built with that really well. And so there's analytics running. There's buttons from different third-party vendors that are loading at that point. But it doesn't block onload, so the user is fully interactive at the time of that blue line, which happens way earlier than on the other side.
So it's really interesting that just by kind of blurring your eyes, we can look at this waterfall and just figure out what's happening just on the shape without even looking at the resources. Right. So we can say, like, we optimized the images, we probably concatenated some files, which is why it became shorter, and a few other things.
Yeah, I mean, there's more that, so mod PageSpeed is not necessarily all that you would ever want to do to make your site fast.
Right.
It's now running in 2-point-something seconds, so you could probably get it down to 1 second because there's a lot of kind of cascading effect here, and there's not much parallelism, especially after onload. And so diving deeper into the waterfalls is something that you might want to do if you want that next level, but kind of without any effort at all, you can get.
Yeah, I'll take it. Right, 2x for just turning on a flag, I'll take it. All right, so now we will go under the hood of this thing. So this is so we'll start with the simple one, right? So HTML, this is an example filter, right? A very simple one, but it would be good, a good introduction to some of the more interesting ones later.
Yeah, so this is kind of the simplest possible filter that you can have. And this is actually a filter that we have in mod PageSpeed today. It's a little bit more involved than this in reality, but this is essentially it. You can, every filter can register for interest in various HTML events, as it were. And as the events stream through the system, we can say, hey, this one's interested in a characters node. That's all Collapse Whitespace cares about. And then it basically just wipes out extra spaces that it's pretty sure can't matter. And cases where it would matter is if it's in a pre-tag, and there's other cases as well.
Right. So it's not as simple as it looks, right? This is not like run a gsub and remove all the spaces, right? You're actually parsing the HTML and you're saying, hey, this is inside of a pre-tag or a script tag, so the white space is significant, but nonetheless, inside of your regular HTML markup, you can still compress the extra white space.
Exactly. And this is a relatively popular filter. It's actually not a core filter.
Interesting.
And that's because we are a little bit conservative, and it is quite possible for an element to have its white space become significant due to a JavaScript event, which is not something that mod PageSpeed currently looks at. So this is a filter that's pretty safe to do, but we leave it up to users to turn it on by default. I've noticed a lot of users do turn this on because it's mostly pretty safe.
Right. OK. That makes sense. So this is a more interesting one, right? So now we're talking combining multiple CSS files. So how does this work?
Right. So the basic idea here is that as we are, as HTML is streaming through mod PageSpeed, we're parsing tags. We're saying, hey, here's 4 link tags. Let's collect all of those together, collect the contents of those, and collect the names of the CSS files.
Right.
And we'll get into how that happens in a few minutes. But what it is that happens is that those 4 link tags get replaced with a single link tag.
Which is the one that we see in the bottom.
Which is the one that we see in the bottom. And it has the names of the original CSS files separated by plus signs, literally.
Right.
And then there is a .pagespeed keyword, which is something that we look for when we are serving it.
It's kind of a hint to mod PageSpeed, if you will. Yeah.
And then there's a code CC, which actually means combined CSS, and then there's a hash, and this hash is very important. This hash is the technology that lets mod PageSpeed serve any resource with a 1-year cache lifetime, because that hash is the MD5 sum of the optimized resource.
So it's the MD5 sum of the combined CSS files.
Right. So it's kind of a signature for this file, or you could think of it as a version of this file.
So if I modify, let's say, big.css and I add extra white space and I save it, the MD5 sum would change and you would regenerate this resource.
That's correct if we didn't minify that CSS file and get rid of that white space.
Okay, right. Okay,
but
so
if you actually
white space is a bad example.
But if you actually change the content of the CSS file, then we would have a different MD5 sum. So we might have cached this one for a year, and you might think it's stale, but it's OK because we'll never reference it again.
Right. OK. And I guess maybe to backtrack a little bit, and the reason I guess we want to do this is fetching multiple files consumes maybe additional TCP connections. So by combining it all together, we have one resource which you can fetch down faster, and hopefully that'll lead to a faster render on the page.
Exactly. This is kind of the height of that waterfall chart that you see.
Right.
If your waterfall chart, for example, doesn't fit on your screen, you know that you have some work to do.
Right. Yes. That's a good rule of thumb in general.
The other point that I want to make is that by providing long cache lifetimes, you make all the caches that are in the network in between the server and the client more effective. You make the browser cache more effective. You make any caching done at the ISP layer more effective, and you make content delivery networks more effective, because the versions of the assets that they store, they know that they don't have to check back with the origin to revalidate for a year.
Right. OK. Very interesting. So let's take a look at the monster diagram. Right. So maybe you can just walk us through what happens when an HTTP request comes in.
Sure. So so this is a view of what happens in Apache. Apache has a module architecture which allows anybody to write their own Apache module that can help make some kind of transformation to the content of the networking.
Would be like mod deflate, mod security. There's lots and lots of these things.
Actually, mod deflate is a really good example, because what that one does is the most important thing that you can do even before you run mod PageSpeed is make sure you have to always compress your output. And that is basically an output filter that just looks at the stream of bytes that are coming through it and just makes them smaller and adds the header to say, by the way, I
so this is a little bit of an aside, but would you use mod deflate with mod PageSpeed?
Actually, if you have mod PageSpeed, we will turn on mod deflate, so they work together.
Interesting.
Mod PageSpeed will be, would be less effective if mod deflate wasn't there.
Sure. Okay.
But they're complementary, because mod PageSpeed doesn't attempt to gzip assets itself. It depends on mod deflate to do that, but it does make them smaller in the first place. And image compression is not really addressed by mod deflate as well. So. The way that an Apache module works is that it can install into the Apache kernel an input filter, which takes requests and mutates them in some way that's particular to the filter. Content generators can look at URLs and say, either, I know how to handle that one, I'll take it over, nobody else needs to worry about it, or that one's not for me, I decline it, I'll pass it on to the next one. And they can install output filters, which just get put into the chain of the byte stream as it goes through.
Right. So here in this diagram, sorry, you just have the PHP handler. So if I have a .php file, it would intercept that and say, hey, that's for me. I would generate the byte stream.
Exactly.
OK.
So mod PageSpeed puts a handler in which looks at those .pagespeed.resources.
So it's like a custom extension.
Exactly. So that's for handling resources, for handling images, CSS, and JavaScript. For HTML, it installs an output filter where it looks at the stream of bytes going by, and whenever it finds HTML, it parses it and tries to make optimizations in it as it goes through. So if an HTML file comes into Apache, what will typically happen is it'll go through the input filters. The PageSpeed resource handler will look at it, but it won't do anything with it because it's not a resource.
Right.
The PHP handler, if it was if PHP was handling those, would take the URL and generate HTML out, which would then be sent to mod PageSpeed's output filter, which would start looking at HTML and deciding based on the tags and the characters that are parsed whether it wants to mutate those bytes or not.
Right.
And an important thing that mod PageSpeed tries to do is never slow down the page. So some of the things that mod PageSpeed does are actually compute intensive or rely on the network.
Right. That was actually going to be my question, right? It sounds like a lot of work. So
there is definitely work going on. So there's HTML parsing, but streaming parsers go fast. That's not really a problem. But when we have to go and optimize an image, well, we have to fetch images, we have to optimize images. We'll do that in the background typically, and also optimize them in the background. So we will only do the tag replacement for images if we already had that in cache.
Interesting. So on the so let's say I've just started my web server, nobody has hit it, and I make the first request, I would still get the original unoptimized resource then?
That's right. Probably, for the most part, your resources will come through unoptimized, but collapse Whitespace would work.
Right. OK. So you would apply filters that work really fast, and then on the second hit, you would actually serve me the optimized content. Exactly. Right. That's a very good point. OK. So maybe one more quick note, which is to say we talked about PHP, but I think it's important to note that one of the strong or popular applications for Apache is that it can act as a proxy. So if you have some other server running somewhere, that can be another app server, maybe it's a Ruby app server, Java, what have you, and you're using mod proxy, this still applies, right? Because it's effectively another handler.
That's correct. It's easy to set up mod PageSpeed as a reverse proxy or actually as a forward proxy as well. And that way it can optimize content that's not necessarily even generated within the Apache server.
Right. So if I have a Java server running right now serving my assets, I could actually put Apache in front, turn on mod PageSpeed, and maybe inherit some of these optimizations for free.
Right. That would be a reverse proxy application.
That's right.
Exactly.
Very cool. So we talked a little bit about images, right? And images are a big deal on the internet today. I think just prior to this, we were kind of talking, and we said that over 50% of all the bandwidth on the internet is video, which is moving pictures, right? But then the second biggest component is still images, right? So you guys put a lot of work into optimizing images in particular, and you already covered some examples, but this is kind of an in-depth look at what happens. Yeah,
this is kind of the life of an image as it flies through mod PageSpeed. So you're right. A lot of the benefit that mod PageSpeed, the real wins in terms of bandwidth usage and latency that mod PageSpeed gets, at least in the core filter set, on first view are from making images smaller. And so we put a lot of effort into that. And this is how it works at a high level. So we install a filter called the image rewriting filter, which scans for elements with image tags. And it looks for the source attribute. And the way that it works in order to not slow down HTML even on the first view is it looks in a metadata cache to see if we've seen this resource at this width and height before. So because we're optimizing images for the element that they're going to be drawn into, those all go into the key of the metadata cache, if you will. And so when that's a hit, if we have a warm server, it doesn't matter whether the browser cache is warm or cold, but if the server cache is warm, then all we have to do to deliver that optimized image is swap out that source attribute with the one that we found in our metadata cache.
With the optimized version of the image.
Exactly. And so if it's a miss, though, then we have to we pretty much have to give up on this round because we're not going to fetch a large image and optimize it on the fly without delaying the HTML. So we spin up a machine that runs in the background, not a physical machine, but a finite state machine that runs in the software. And it goes off and it does the fetch. And of the image resource, it runs the image optimization algorithms, and we discussed what those were before. So we can do transcoding, we'll do resizing, and we'll do recompression.
Right, and I'm guessing you guys also do stuff like removing extra metadata, which is pretty popular in like PNG images, right?
Sure, that's actually in the core set. We'll remove the metadata and resize, and then it's an option to recompress.
Actually, and I'll highlight the resize because I think this is very, very important. You mentioned it, but I think it's still worth talking about for a little bit. So if I have an image, say if I have an image tag that says the width of this image is 100 pixels and the height is 100 pixels, right? So it's a square. But I can actually push a larger image into it. It can be 1,000 by 1,000, which is actually not uncommon on the internet, right? Somebody takes a photo, they resize it in their whatever editor, they upload it, and you're actually getting the full res image, which then get rescaled in the browser. So just by providing the width and height in the markup, Mod PageSpeed will be smart enough to look at that and say, yes, but the origin image is much bigger, so let me rescale that and serve the proper version.
Yep, and I would go further to say not only is it not uncommon, it's quite common to take images from your camera.
So this alone is like, it saves me a lot of time, right? Because if I'm thinking about, if I have a lot of images, you mentioned kind of the newspaper use case earlier, right? Lots of images there. I can just define the width and height and push kind of the resizing logic to Mod PageSpeed.
Exactly.
That's very cool.
And so we do this kind of gauntlet of image optimizations, and when it comes out the other side, we have a new URL with kind of the instructions on how that got created and coded into it. So this image in this example, this is on modpagespeed.com, which has all of our examples. On modpagespeed.com, you'll find this puzzle.jpg is the origin image that's shown in green. The width in which it was displayed in our sample page is 256 by 192.
Right. So this is from the HTML markup.
Exactly.
Yep.
It was a JPEG file originally, but we were displaying it in Chrome, and we took it, and now we're going to transcode it to WebP so that it's delivered more efficiently.
Right.
We also put into the URL the MD5 sum of this image file, so we can serve it for a long time, and even if I change puzzle.jpg, then it won't be a problem with stale caches.
It's kind of a similar pattern to what we saw with CSS earlier.
Exactly.
Okay, and I guess the WebP one is really interesting because this would get served, you mentioned, because this is in Chrome, you get WebP. But if I visited the same website in, let's say, Firefox browser, which currently does not, unfortunately, support WebP, I would still get a JPEG.
Exactly. So as a site owner, you can make a decision that by using Mod PageSpeed that you're going to serve images in a modern web format that is not supported by all browsers, but your site will still work well on all browsers.
Very cool. Yeah. So that's not even something that I could do with a build step, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Very nice.
So I wanted to dive into a little bit of what the PageSpeed optimization library is.
So this is the part that powers Mod PageSpeed.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. So this is a server-independent library that does all of these optimizations. And the way that it gets hooked up to, and again, this is completely open source software, but the way that it gets hooked into a server stack is that whoever is doing that supplies some mechanism to do HTTP fetching and some mechanism to do caching.
Sure.
And these in different environments, there are different technologies for accomplishing these things.
These things you implemented in Apache. So Apache, I'm guessing, already has an HTTP fetcher, which you reused, but the cache is likely something that you guys have implemented yourself.
Sure. Actually, the cache that we use for Mod PageSpeed is also open sourced, but and would be the default setting. But typically, in a server, in a serving environment that has some maturity to it, there'll be some other caching solution you'll want to use instead of the one that we have open sourced.
So in fact, maybe could I even use something like, if I'm building something with this library, I could use like memcache.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, you're kind of forcing me to tip my hand. So, so a feature that we will be releasing soon, but is not yet in 1.0, is support of memcache, which is an important. It's an important feature for scaling up websites.
Right. Nice. Okay, so if I have an extra or a custom server, I could actually take this and build my own Mod PageSpeed variant.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. There's API documentation on the web in the developer site.
Yep.
And we would be happy to support actively anybody interested in porting this to a new platform.
Right. And we'll mention this later, but you guys do have an active Google group where people can come in, discuss, propose new filters, file bugs, all that kind of stuff. So.
Yep. There's actually a variety of support forums. There's the Google groups. There's the issues list.
Yep.
People seem to be fairly active on Stack Overflow as well. We try to be responsive.
I see a lot of questions there. Yep.
We try to be responsive to that, but we track everything in our issues list, which is all accessed off of code.google.com.
Right. Yep. Okay. Perfect. So I wanted to highlight a few kind of tips, configuration tricks, and a few other things. So we looked at the guts. We talked about kind of high-level things, but one question that I get quite commonly with mod PageSpeed is like, okay, great. So I grabbed this, install it, I ran these 3 commands, now it's on. What if it doesn't work? Or I'm scared. Or like, how can I experiment with mod PageSpeed? And there's a couple of ways to do that. First of all, there's because we have this additional module installed, you can actually configure it through a couple of different ways, right? So you can use query parameters that will be intercepted by mod PageSpeed. So for example, in this rewrite CSS example, we have mod PageSpeed equals on, which basically says turn on mod PageSpeed for this request only, right? So you could have it disabled, but I'm going to enable it here. And by the way, enable the specific filter, right? So if I want to experiment with some non-core filter, I can just pass this in, see what happens, kind of test the waters, and then decide if I want to make that the default for my configuration or not.
Yeah, it's kind of a way to interactively, rapidly iterate on your site without having to restart Apache.
I think it's one of my favorite features. I love just being able to quickly get feedback on, how's this going to look. One alternative to that is to actually send HTTP headers, right? So if you have some sort of client or server solution that you want to test with, that's another way. And then the last one is, we actually mentioned this, the mod proxy, forward proxy example, right? Where you can actually say, please fetch me this other site and run it through PageSpeed and show me what will happen when we do that.
Yeah, this is a very good way if you're considering the option of using mod PageSpeed on your site, but you're nervous about like installing it and rolling it out to your users without kind of looking at it first.
Let me install it on 1,000 servers and see what happens.
You can install it on one server local to your system, which isn't running your origin content. It's running as a proxy, and then you can look at your site through mod PageSpeed by setting a browser proxy.
Right. That's a very handy tool. And in fact, both of these, or all 3 of these, are documented really well on the mod PageSpeed site, right? So I have a link down here, but if you guys search on your favorite search engine for mod PageSpeed and experiment, you'll find instructions for how to set up the mod proxy, which is really handy. I wanted to highlight this, which is, we mentioned already that there's a lot of different filters, and we do have good documentation. And there's a couple of different resources. So one that you mentioned, which is modpagespeed.com, right, where we actually list all the filters, and we actually also provide the demos, right? So it's usually kind of a simple file which illustrates what the filter does. So if you guys want to take a look at that, that's a very good place. And another one is the, once again, the configuration or config filters page on our developers.google.com site, where we actually explain what each one does, and we also highlight which ones are in the core set and not, right? And another thing I'll mention is that by default, when you enable mod PageSpeed, as Josh said, you have your core filters, but you can actually say, don't worry about the core filters, right? I'm going to hand tune all the filters myself. So you can customize it completely for your site. Yep.
Yep. By turning on the core filters, what you're doing is you're saying that you're kind of letting us make the decision as we move the software forward and advance it of what we think is safe for most sites, and you'll take that. If you want to have total control, and when you upgrade, you'll decide which filters you want to enable for the new release, then you can put it in pass-through mode and then add the filters that you want.
Right. So that's a good point. So I should probably, unless I have specific reason to avoid core filters, I could leave that on, because maybe in the subsequent release, you guys have added another filter or improved another filter such that now it's considered safe, and that would just be automatically included during an upgrade.
Yep. I'll give you an example. I believe in the current release, we have a filter called flatten CSS imports. Like one of the biggest anti-patterns for performance in CSS files is to use @import. But it's incredibly convenient to do it as a designer. That's what you want. You want to be able to structure your code. It's like
allows you want modular code.
You want modular code, so that's a good thing. It's bad how it's delivered.
Yep.
Mod PageSpeed with the flatten CSS imports filter will flatten those all out, so you get the best performance when you deliver it, but you don't have to maintain that.
Yep.
That was something that we built into the product some time ago, but we wanted to do a lot of testing on it to make sure it was rock solid.
Right.
That's being promoted into the core filters in the next release after 1.0.
Okay.
And so if you have core filters, then you just get that.
Interesting. Okay, that's good to know. So we also touched on some configuration, but one of the really nice things about Apache is that you can configure it in a million different ways, right? So there's your Apache config where you can specify your virtual hosts. So mod PageSpeed can be configured at a VHost level, right? So an example down here, we're saying mod PageSpeed is on for this example site, and pass-through is actually that command that tells us to don't include the core filters. I'll hand tune the filters that I want, right? So we're just enabling these, I guess, 5 filters for this example site. But I can also be much more granular. I can use the htaccess file. So for example, if I have my VHost, so I have my example file, but in my assets, right? I want to have a different set of filters. I could actually drop in an htaccess file with another configuration.
Right. And there's yet another twist, which is you can use a directory scope in the configuration file.
Right. So I could literally have kind of different filters running on different subsections of my site.
Exactly. There's kind of like the implementation of just how the options get configured is itself a pretty big topic within the mod PageSpeed code base, because you can configure by request headers, by query parameters, by virtual host, by directory scope, by virtual host, and at the root.
Yeah, but I think it highlights the fact that our users have asked for that, so they are using all of these mechanisms to customize their sites. So we needed to have it, and it allows you a lot of flexibility, which is very nice. And experiments. So I think this is something that you guys added just recently.
That's right. We've been traditionally using web page test, which is an amazing tool for doing detailed analysis. That's how we produce the video and the waterfall diagrams that we saw earlier.
Right.
But it is, web page test will allow you to run your tests from a set of servers that are running in some corner of the world. There's ones in Singapore, in Dublin, in Virginia, and so on. But what you really want to do at some point after you deploy is see what experience your actual users are having.
Right.
And so what this does is it injects some performance measurement using Google Analytics right into the web pages and allows you to bucket users into experiment groups.
Interesting.
And you can say, for example, first of all, you would establish what Google Analytics ID you want to report the data to. And then you can say, well, I'm going to send a third of my users into kind of a control bucket which doesn't have any optimizations in it. Mod PageSpeed is running, but it isn't doing anything except injecting the analytics experiment.
Right.
The second one, we can say, let's just have the image compression and nothing else. And the third one, let's have the default settings. Or you can there's a whole set of options that you can do to customize your experiments. Then you can let this run for a day, a week, depending on the experiments. You might leave a small control group just to see how it's doing, and go back to log into Google Analytics and see how many how users from each bucket are faring in terms of the latency that they're seeing on their web pages.
So this is really cool, right? So what you've described there is the difference between synthetic testing and RUM, or real user measurement, which I think is what you're referring to when you're saying about Google Analytics, right?
Yes.
So by setting this, and we actually had an episode with Justin Catroni from Google Analytics where we talked about navigation timing and why it's so important, right? And the point that Justin always loves to make is that it's great that the developers want to optimize the site. They always want to optimize the site, but how does it affect my bottom line, right? Like the business metrics, the dollars, as you put it. So this will actually tell you, right? So we have 3 buckets here, and if I have in my Google Analytics some conversion metrics, that could be a purchase, that could be a registration, even time on site or bounce rate, now I could measure against that and say, well, you know what? Users that get a faster experience are staying for longer, maybe they're converting for more, and that makes for a very compelling case to the rest of the team to say this is why we should invest into more performance optimization.
Exactly.
Right. Awesome. So I love the business use case, right? It's not just like speed for speed's sake. Although speed for speed's sake is also good because it makes the web faster. So this example, this is actually a very common question that we see, which is many people have already applied some optimizations to their site. So a good example of that is something like domain sharding, right? Where the problem is that modern browsers have up to, or allow up to 6 connections per host. So if you're hosting a lot of images on your domain, you may get blocked as you're trying to download a lot of images. So the general best practice for that is to say, well, host it on different subdomains, and then that'll allow the browser to open multiple connections, or more than 6, I should say. But that creates a little bit of complexity for my PageSpeed, right? This is where you need to kind of hand-tune your configuration, right? So can you explain what's happening here?
Sure. So, the challenge is that you want to, well, there's a couple of challenges. So if somebody has hand-sharded their domains,
yep,
or in many cases, just done a simple best practice of moving their resources to cookieless domains, which is all good.
Right, right.
The first thing that you have to do if you want mod PageSpeed to be effective is you have to let us know what those domains are, because mod PageSpeed doesn't know what the domain mapping is. Sure. So we have pagespeed.conf settings to tell us. So the first thing you have to tell us is, what are the domains that are basically equivalent in the on your site? And so if you have like static.example.com, your HTML is coming on www.example.com.
Right.
You have to authorize, at least with mod PageSpeed domain, static.example.com.
Right.
The next step, and if you've done hand sharding, you may have to authorize more than one of those and tell us that they are essentially equivalent by mapping them to kind of a canonical name.
Right. So if I'm running example.com, right, and I'm serving images from example.com, then mod PageSpeed would say, yes, I know that I'm hosting this, hence I can optimize this asset.
Exactly.
But if I'm hosting on a cdn.example.com, that could be anywhere, or it can be a third-party asset. So mod PageSpeed won't touch that by default.
Right. If, for example, you're serving an image on Flickr or something, Flickr is not yet running mod PageSpeed. And so if you just rewrite the URL the way we did with the .pagespeed and it's on Flickr, then it just won't work.
Right.
Because Flickr won't be able to decode that name.
Right. Yep.
So we wouldn't necessarily authorize that. But if you have images on your site that you want to put onto a CDN that knows how to reach back to your origin, then you can do a domain mapping to say, I want to take the images that are on example.com and put them on cdn.example.com. Now when mod PageSpeed rewrites that URL, when it optimizes the image or the CSS file, etc., it will rewrite the domain to go onto the CDN. This is, I think, kind of a development feature which allows you, for example, to develop locally and turn that off, but then when you're ready to actually push resources to the CDN, you can turn that on. This also allows you to apply sharding. So by establishing the shards that, if you want to, for example, shard 2 ways, then you can use the command that we gave here, mod PageSpeed shard domain example.com to example1.
That's the bottom one here.
And, and example2. And then mod PageSpeed will kind of randomly disperse the resources to those 2 domains so that you can have more parallel connections.
Yep. Yeah, so this is definitely a more advanced use case where you have to kind of reach deeper into mod PageSpeed and also think about how does this work in the context of me using a CDN. But that in itself is actually an important point. It is CDN friendly, right? So you can make it work with your CDN provider and help your CDN serve optimized assets.
Exactly. And this is something that I think it's useful to experiment with. One of the things that you probably don't want to do is try to hand shard your resources in your HTML file, because the best practice is to shard domains, but exactly to what?
Right.
I've seen the right answer be 4, the right answer be 2, the right answer can sometimes just be 1.
Yes.
And so all the effort you do into hacking your HTML to edit the domains, you really is kind of counter to the notion that you want to experiment with it. And you can experiment very easily by just iterating over your pagespeed.conf file and looking at web page test.
Yeah, that certainly makes it a lot easier. Yeah. So we talked about the forward proxy, but I recently came across a blog post. I think it was Frank Dennis that wrote this really awesome blog post that kind of blew me away, because what he did was he used mod PageSpeed as a forwarding proxy for his phone. And the basic observation was that when you're on your mobile device, right, you probably you don't have a Wi-Fi connection most of the time. You're in 3G, if you're lucky, you're on 4G, what have you, and you're downloading these massive websites, right? So why not, instead of using mod PageSpeed to accelerate your site, why not use mod PageSpeed to accelerate the rest of the web as you fetch it, right? So in this diagram here, I have my phone. We're sending a request through this forward proxy, which is running mod PageSpeed. Mod PageSpeed requests the actual site that I requested. I get this fat response back, right, with all kinds of unoptimized images, etc. Mod PageSpeed crunches all of that and sends me the optimized assets, which I thought was really, really clever. So he did this with his iPhone, and he observed that, you know, for the sites that he tested it on, he got much faster renders and much fewer bytes. And in fact, he shared some examples, and we'll take a look at those later. But these are the actual filters that he used, right? So he shared those. And some examples that I wanted to highlight was, first, he enabled core filters. So that's kind of by default, but I think he just wanted to have it in there to be explicit. He said, I'm going to rewrite images, convert JPEGs to WebP, so he knows that he's accessing, I guess, this on maybe a Chrome on iOS when he's using that, convert PNG to JPEG. And in fact, this is an important one that you mentioned earlier. Now, when I'm on a mobile device, I have a small screen. I probably don't want the 100% fidelity of all the pixels. I'm OK with the 75% compression ratio, and that gives me a lot of savings, byte savings for images, right? So this is kind of an interesting example. And he also did kind of a couple of aggressive filters, which say defer all iframes until after unload and other things, just to accelerate his browsing.
Yep, and pointing out in particular, defer JavaScript has a huge impact on the speed of websites.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that that you want to look at the results of when you do it, but it was aggressive to put it into a forward proxy, but he was extremely happy having done it.
Right, yeah, and these are some examples, right? So, of course, this is not representative of the entire web, but he kind of highlighted a few. So, for example, this overblog URL, it went from 400 kilobytes to 271, which is pretty significant, right? But going from 39 seconds of unload to 2 seconds is a big improvement, right? Mm-hmm. And not only that, but you can see that because he was combining resources, it went from 34 to 21. So the mobile browser had to make fewer requests. All of those things are win, and he got a better mobile experience. Now this next one just kind of completely blew me away because I didn't believe it, but serves as a good example. Cooking with Frank, right? So this is a blog, lots of pictures, and guess what? The unoptimized version is 3.15 megs. With compression, it comes out to be 10 times smaller, 340 kilobytes. So when I'm on my mobile data plan, I probably want the 340 kilobyte version. It'll load much faster, and instead of making 85 requests, it made 28 requests. So this is a dramatic difference.
Yeah, we're still learning exactly what works really well on what kind of mobile device and what kind of connection, but it seems likely that having a lot less requests will benefit mobile even more than it will benefit desktop.
Yeah, so this in general seems like a very interesting area to explore for mod PageSpeed, mm-hmm. right? Like, now I want this on my phone. Mm-hmm. So just a quick recap, we've covered a lot of stuff here, right? So we talked about the 1.0, upcoming 1.0 release. It's an open source Apache module. It works with 2.2 and 2.4. Kind of the pitch, if you will, is just-in-time performance optimization for your website. And it's already very widely kind of deployed across the web. So it's we feel it's 1.0 ready. It's 1.0 ready by Google standards, which is the perpetual beta, yeah. Right? So that says a lot. But one question I do have for you is, what's after 1.0? Are we done?
I feel like we're at the beginning of this process. We've definitely discovered that there's some meat to chew on here. There's a lot more that we can do. Speedy is an obvious topic. Mm-hmm. The rules change when you're working with Speedy. Combining becomes less important because you can multiplex multiple resources over the same connection, Inlining becomes less important.
Same reason, right?
There, in the release that is coming after the 1.0 release, we'll start seeing some of the deeper speedy integration.
Right.
So Google also has a module called Mod Speedy, which we work pretty well with, and we'll be doing, look for more in that space.
Right.
I would say the big wins that we have right now: images, extending cache lifetime, which is something that really benefits kind of repeat viewers to things like news sites, deferring JavaScript. There's kind of other big areas where we're more aware of the networking characteristics of the page, and we're optimizing. I feel like we're relatively early in our understanding. We've found a lot of good things to do, but when we find good things to do, it usually uncovers 10 more that we don't have time to do yet.
Yeah. So I think that's very representative of the web performance community in general, right? Like, I think we're still finding a lot of interesting edge cases, and the browsers are only getting smarter. We're only getting more and more assets on the web. So in fact, we know that the web pages are growing both in size and number of requests. So it sounds like there's a lot of work to do still.
There's an astounding amount of work to do, but I think that we've come to a point now where we have a stake in the ground, where we have demonstrable benefit, we have adoption, and we'd like to grow it, and we're ready to take off from here. I'm
glad that you guys are doing it, because that makes my life a little bit easier, right? I can install this and inherit all the work that you've put into this. So I think for the last slide here, we've covered some of these, but I want to highlight these because I get these questions quite frequently on Stack Overflow, through email and through other means. So I kind of bucketed them, right? We already talked about mod deflate, mod expires. So those work together with mod PageSpeed.
That's right. In fact, mod PageSpeed turns mod deflate on, and it's kind of dependent on mod expires, because we have to know how often to pull the origin resource.
Right.
And what you definitely want to put an expires header. You want to use that.
Yeah.
Tell us how often to check back to see if your resource has updated. Actually, I just want to point out one other thing. Mod PageSpeed can also look directly at the file system, in which case it can just stat the file to see if it's changed, which is a little bit more efficient if you if your files are right there on the same server, as opposed to being generated by PHP or pulled from somewhere else.
Actually, that's a good point. That's another config flag that you can find in our documentation.
That's correct. So that's mod PageSpeed load from file, and I think that if the files are there on your disk, just get mod PageSpeed to look at them directly. But if they're not, and we have to do a fetch to get them, then you definitely want to use mod expires to tell us how often to do that fetch.
Right. Okay. For the CDN, I think we covered it a little bit, but
yeah, we covered it. CDNs are driven by the cacheability of resources, and we make things cacheable for a year.
Yeah, which also I think answers the next question, which is if you're using a CDN, or maybe if you're not using a CDN rather, but you are using another cache in front, maybe a Squid, a Varnish, what have you, maybe even an Nginx, those should still work, right?
Exactly.
They just be more efficient.
Exactly. They'll just have to pull the origin less often.
Yep. Okay. Perfect. So we talked about, or we mentioned, the mod PageSpeed cache, right? So mod PageSpeed has its own cache. We talked about the upcoming memcache. But is that, as a developer, do I need to worry about that? So if I have my assets, and who manages that, right? If I update my asset, do I need to worry about flushing the cache, etc.?
So mod PageSpeed comes pre-configured to use the file system as a cache.
Okay.
And that works reasonably well. As you scale up websites, you have to think a little bit. We set the default cache, I think, at 100 megabytes. Is that enough for your assets, or do you want to make that grow?
So that's something I could probably tweak in the configuration.
That's another configuration parameter. How often we go and garbage collect that cache is another question. So when you change your assets, you don't have to manually purge the cache.
Right.
Mod PageSpeed will just do it automatically.
And that was actually that file name kind of scheme that we looked at earlier, right?
The files on the cache have recognizable names, but they're not exactly that scheme.
Okay.
But the hierarchy of your URL space for your assets is reflected in the cache. So you can kind of poke around the cache and see what we have in there, and you can just delete it. They're just files.
Right. But it sounds like, generally speaking, I shouldn't be touching it.
But you don't really need to touch it. You can just configure how big you want it to be and how often you think we should go and purge it.
Perfect.
And upcoming, you'll be able to say, well, I want to, instead of storing the files on the disk, I want to store them in memcache.
Yep.
And here are the host and port numbers of my memcache instances.
Sure.
And then you can share that cache among multiple servers so that you can scale up your website a little bit better.
Yeah, that's very cool. So we actually talked about affecting or not affecting the page load time when the cache is empty. So that was that if we don't have the image resource optimized, we will just serve the original image, but on the next hit, you will get the optimized resource. So as you said, the last thing that mod PageSpeed wants to do is to make your site slower. That would be the anti-pattern.
Yes.
So that should never happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'm guessing all of this work does consume some resources. So what should we expect? If I install this on my server, is there kind of an average number, but does it really vary based on the site? Because it seems like it would, right?
Sure. A very image-rich site that installs mod PageSpeed for the first time will go through a period where we'll use resources on the server to optimize the images. Mm-hmm. There'll be a bounded amount of resources. We will only, this is actually another config parameter that you can set, because we don't know exactly how many CPUs you have or anything.
Sure.
But by default, we will do, I believe, 8 concurrent image optimizations maximum per physical machine.
Right, so it's like background workers optimizing these images.
And that's across all the Apache processes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it doesn't just fan out arbitrarily until it kills your machine.
Right, yeah, that would be an anti-pattern.
Yes, that would be another anti-pattern for serving your resources efficiently. But what will happen is, like if you have a file, a page full of images, and the first time somebody goes to them, we'll start spinning up the optimization of those. Once those are in cache, that'll settle back down. So they'll typically be a few minutes. It would vary on the site where all these images get optimized, put into the cache, and then you're good to go. If the cache is too small, then there might be an ongoing.
So for the most part, right, if your website doesn't change dramatically every couple of minutes, chances are your visitors will be just hitting the cache, and you would only see this extra work being done when you have new assets, or if for whatever reason that asset got evicted from the cache.
Right.
Right, and that's where you may want to go back and configure or check if your cache being used up. Maybe you should increase the size or something to that extent.
This is probably also a good time to point out that mod PageSpeed offers some visibility into what it's doing, because it has a statistics page. Mm-hmm. So on the local server, you can go to mod PageSpeed statistics, which by default is accessible only from localhost.
Yeah. Yep.
But you can configure that too. And then you'll see, how many image rewrites are going on.
Right.
You'll see a variety of statistics, which kind of give you a way to put your finger on the pulse of mod PageSpeed and see what it's up to.
I'm guessing if I'm using some monitoring system, I could probably get the variables out of there, shove it into Ganglia or some other system, and track all of that performance data as well.
It's very scrapable, and in fact, I think very soon after mod PageSpeed was released, people started to say, well, I've hooked this up to this visualization system, and here's what it's doing.
That's the first thing that I would look for as well. Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. So shifting gears a little bit, we didn't specifically talk about mobile, with the exception of, I guess, the forward proxy, but is there anything in particular that we need to be aware about for mobile and mod PageSpeed?
Mod PageSpeed, this is actually one of the areas where I think we can do a lot more in the future, but we're already providing a substantial benefit. Making things smaller and less requests, it's all good.
Images, we saw that, right?
It's all good. What Frank Dennis did was he cranked the quality level down to 75.
Yeah.
Typically, we would recommend, if you want to do this for desktop, we would say 85 is a very safe number. Mm-hmm. But for mobile, you might want to crank it down further.
Right.
I can't think of anything that mod PageSpeed does that would be undesirable for mobile. I think it's all good.
Right. Well, as you said, smaller resources, fewer requests. All of those things are like prime candidates for improving mobile performance. The
only question is there more we can do, and the answer is absolutely. And look, stay tuned.
Right.
we'll be making
Okay.
further
And I think
updates.
that's a good note to kind of end this on, right? I'll just mention that we do have a lot of online resources about mod PageSpeed if we didn't answer your question. So good places to start are modpagespeed.com. I think there's actually links to the Google group, the issue list, and demos there. So that's a great place to kind of kick off your exploration. We do have a Google group where you can ask questions. And of course, you can also just reach out to myself or Josh, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. So thank you, guys.
Thanks.